Neuroscience describes the electrical activity of neurons with extraordinary precision, tracks the chemical cascades at synapses, maps functional networks across cortical regions, and predicts behavioral outputs from brain states with increasing accuracy. Yet none of this explains why there is something it feels like to see red, to taste salt, or to recall a childhood memory. This isn't a gap in data. It's a conceptual boundary that remains even when every physical detail is known. The distinction matters because it reveals where scientific explanation stops being sufficient. We can trace the entire causal chain, from photons striking the retina to action potentials in V1 to recognition in temporal cortex. We know which neurons fire when someone reports seeing their grandmother's face, but knowing which neurons fire doesn't tell us why that firing produces the subjective experience of recognition, the warmth, the familiarity, the sense of her. The brain's machinery is transparent. The mind's existence remains opaque. This isn't mysticism. It's a statement about explanatory adequacy. When physicists explain why ice expands, the explanation connects microstructure to observable behavior through continuous logical steps. There's no point where we throw up our hands and say, and then somehow it just feels cold. But with consciousness, that's exactly where we are. We can describe correlation, this brain state accompanies this experience, but correlation isn't explanation. Saying C fibers firing correlates with pain doesn't explain why C fiber activity feels like anything at all. The problem becomes clearer when we distinguish what neuroscience actually accomplishes. It excels at functional explanation. How does the visual system discriminate edges? Through lateral inhibition and center surround receptive fields. How does memory consolidation occur? Through synaptic plasticity and protein synthesis during sleep. These are mechanistic accounts, linking structure to function. They answer, how does the brain do X, with descriptions of neural operations. But subjective experience doesn't fit this pattern. Consider pain. Neuroscience identifies nociceptors, traces pain pathways through the spinothalamic tract, locates processing in the anterior cingulate cortex. We understand the mechanism completely, yet none of this explains the hurt, the qualitative character that makes pain bad rather than merely informationally significant. A robot could implement the same functional architecture, respond to tissue damage, withdraw from harmful stimuli, even report, "I am in pain," based on its sensors. Would it hurt? The question isn't whimsical. It exposes the gap between describing what a system does and accounting for what it experiences. Neuroscience maps the first domain exhaustively. The second domain, phenomenal consciousness, the felt quality of experience, resists the same treatment. Not because we lack data, but because our explanatory tools seem categorically mismatched to the target. Philosophers call this the hard problem of consciousness, a term introduced by David Chalmers in the mid-1990s. Chalmers distinguished it from the easy problems: attention, discrimination, reportability, wakefulness, which are mechanistically tractable even if not yet fully solved. The easy problems ask how the brain performs various functions. The hard problem asks why performing those functions is accompanied by subjective experience at all. Why doesn't it all happen in the dark, with no inner life, no felt quality, no first-person perspective? No shoe too high. One response denies the distinction entirely. Philosophers like Daniel Dennett argue the hard problem is an artifact of confused intuitions rather than a genuine explanatory failure. On this view, once we fully explain the functional architecture of consciousness, how information is globally broadcast, how self-monitoring systems create a sense of unified experience, how memory and attention interact, there's nothing left to explain. The feeling that something remains mysterious is just our intuition lagging behind the science. This deflationary approach has intellectual appeal. It avoids positing irreducible properties beyond physical explanation. It keeps consciousness within the scope of neuroscience rather than creating a special category requiring new physics or metaphysics. And it aligns with scientific practice, which has repeatedly dissolved apparent mysteries by revealing underlying mechanisms. Vitalism fell when biochemistry explained metabolism without invoking life force. Perhaps consciousness will follow the same trajectory, but the deflation strategy faces a stubborn challenge. Even granting that we can explain all the functions associated with consciousness, this doesn't obviously explain why those functions feel like anything. Explaining how the brain discriminates red from green doesn't explain the redness of red, the specific qualitative character of that colour experience. Explaining how memory retrieval works doesn't explain the subjective sense of remembering, the feeling of pastness that distinguishes recall from imagination. This is where the concept of qualia becomes relevant. Qualia are the intrinsic subjective qualities of experience, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the metallic taste of copper. They're what philosophers mean by what it's like to have an experience. The challenge is that qualia seem fundamentally private and ineffable. You can't convey what red looks like to someone who's never seen colour. You can describe wavelengths, neural responses, cultural associations, but none of this captures the actual phenomenal quality. Neuroscience can identify neural correlates of specific qualia. When subjects report seeing red, certain patterns of activity occur in visual cortex. When they report pain, nociceptive pathways activate. These correlations are robust and replicable. But correlation doesn't establish identity or explanation. Finding the neural correlate of red experience tells us which brain state accompanies that experience. It doesn't tell us why that particular brain state produces that particular quale, rather than some other phenomenal quality or no quality at all. This explanatory gap persists even with complete neural knowledge. Imagine a neuroscientist who has never experienced colour. She's lived her entire life in a grayscale environment, but has learned everything physical science knows about colour vision. She understands cone cells, wavelength processing, opponent channels, colour constancy algorithms. She can predict exactly which neural patterns correspond to seeing red. Then one day, she leaves her monochrome room and sees a ripe tomato. Does she learn something new? The thought experiment, known as Mary's room, aims to show that physical knowledge doesn't exhaust knowledge about consciousness. Mary knew all the physical facts but didn't know what red looks like until she experienced it. This suggests phenomenal knowledge, knowledge of what experiences are like, constitutes a distinct category that can't be derived from physical description alone. No amount of neurological detail would have told Mary what red looks like before she saw it. Critics respond that Mary gains only acquaintance, not propositional knowledge. She doesn't learn new facts, she just encounters the referent of facts she already knew. Before seeing red, she knew that red experience corresponds to this neural pattern. After seeing red, she knows the same fact but can now directly access the experience that fact describes. The knowledge is the same, only her epistemic relation to it has changed. This debate remains unresolved because it hinges on what counts as knowledge and explanation. If explanation requires only describing structure and function, then neuroscience provides complete explanations of mental phenomena. If explanation must also account for phenomenal character, for what experiences feel like from the inside, then something remains unexplained. The disagreement isn't about empirical facts, but about explanatory standards. A related puzzle involves philosophical zombies, hypothetical beings physically identical to humans but lacking conscious experience. Zombies would have the same neurons firing the same patterns, producing the same behaviors, even reporting "I am conscious" based on their internal monitoring systems. But the lights would be off inside. Nothing would feel like anything to them. Whether zombies are conceivable tells us something about consciousness. If zombies are logically possible, if we can coherently imagine them without contradiction, then consciousness can't be identical to physical processes. Something would differ between zombies and conscious humans despite physical identity, namely the presence or absence of subjective experience. This suggests consciousness involves non-physical properties that physical duplication doesn't guarantee, but conceivability doesn't guarantee possibility. We can conceive of water not being H2O. Imagine a substance that looks and behaves like water, but has different molecular structure. Yet water is necessarily H2O. The conceivability of alternatives reflects our ignorance, not genuine possibility. Perhaps the same applies to consciousness. The conceivability of zombies might reflect our incomplete understanding of how consciousness relates to brain processes, not the actual separability of mind and brain. These philosophical arguments circle around a central tension. Physical descriptions operate in third-person terms, objective, quantitative, publicly accessible. Conscious experience is irreducibly first-person, subjective, qualitative, private. Neuroscience excels at third-person description, but seems unable to bridge to first-person perspective. Even knowing everything about someone's brain state, we don't thereby know what their experience feels like. We infer their experience from behavior and similarity to our own case, but the inference remains indirect. This asymmetry shows up in clinical contexts. When neurologists assess consciousness in brain-injured patients, they rely on behavioral markers: eye-opening, verbal response, motor response. These indicators correlate with consciousness, but don't constitute it. A patient might satisfy all behavioral criteria, yet lack subjective experience, or conversely, be conscious while unable to demonstrate it behaviorally. We have no direct way to detect consciousness. We infer it from physical signs that usually accompany it. The situation improves somewhat with neural imaging. Rather than relying purely on behavior, we can examine brain activity patterns associated with conscious states. Specific networks involving posterior cortical regions show activity during conscious perception. When these networks are disrupted through anesthesia, deep sleep, or brain damage, consciousness typically disappears. This moves us beyond crude behavioral tests toward more direct neural markers, but even refined neural markers face the same conceptual problem. Activity in posterior cortical hot zones correlates with conscious experience, yet correlation, however precise, doesn't explain why that activity produces experience. We're still describing which brain states accompany consciousness, without accounting for why any brain state should generate subjective awareness. The explanatory gap persists at every level of neural description, from single neurons to large-scale networks. Some neuroscientists respond that explanation has limits. We shouldn't expect to derive subjective qualities from objective descriptions any more than we'd expect to taste chocolate by reading its chemical formula. Different modes of access provide different kinds of knowledge. Neuroscience offers third-person knowledge about brain mechanisms. Conscious experience provides first-person knowledge about phenomenal qualities. Both are real and valid, but they operate in distinct explanatory registers that don't reduce to each other. This position, sometimes called explanatory pluralism, accepts multiple valid descriptions of the same phenomena without requiring one description to absorb others. Mental states and brain states aren't identical, but aren't separate substances either. They're different ways of characterizing the same underlying reality, suited to different explanatory purposes. When treating psychiatric disorders, brain-level description guides pharmacological intervention. When understanding someone's motivations, mental-level description provides insight their neural activity patterns don't obviously convey. Yet pluralism raises its own questions. If mental and physical descriptions characterize the same thing, what is that thing? Is it fundamentally physical, with mental descriptions being convenient shortcuts? Or does it have irreducibly mental properties that physical science can't capture? The former position risks eliminating the mind by reducing it to brain. The latter risks dualism by treating mind as something beyond physical processes. Neither option satisfies completely. The tension becomes acute when considering causation. Mental states seem causally relevant. You decide to raise your arm, and it rises. Your desire for water causes you to reach for a glass. Beliefs and intentions explain behavior in ways purely neural descriptions don't easily replicate. Yet causation operates at the physical level. Neurons fire, muscles contract, behavior occurs. So where does mental causation fit? Is it epiphenomenal, a causally inert accompaniment to neural processes? Or do mental states somehow influence physical events? Standard neuroscience avoids this question by treating mental descriptions as high-level summaries of neural processes. When we say, Sarah decided to leave because she was angry, we're describing a computational process implemented in neural circuitry. The decision and the neural process aren't two separate events, one causing the other. They're the same event described at different levels of abstraction. Mental causation is just neural causation described in psychological terms. This preserves causal closure, the principle that physical effects have complete physical causes, while acknowledging mental descriptions' explanatory utility. But it doesn't obviously solve the hard problem. Even granting that mental states are implemented in neural states, we're still left asking why neural states implementing mental processes feel like anything. The implementation relationship explains how mind depends on brain, not why brain processes generate subjective experience. The implementation relationship clarifies dependency without dissolving mystery. Knowing that mental states supervene on neural states, that changing the brain necessarily changes the mind, tells us mental phenomena aren't free-floating. They're anchored in physical processes, yet supervenience describes structure, not mechanism. It specifies that A depends on B, without explaining how B produces A. You can't have mind without brain, just as you can't have liquidity without H2O molecules. But knowing water molecules are necessary for liquidity doesn't illuminate why particular molecular arrangements feel wet. The relationship between levels runs deeper than mere correlation, while stopping short of explanation. This becomes evident when examining what neuroscience actually measures. Brain imaging detects blood flow changes, electrical field fluctuations, metabolic activity, all physical processes. These measurements correlate reliably with the reported experiences. When subjects view faces, posterior fusiform gyrus activates. During pain, anterior cingulate cortex shows heightened activity. The correlations are robust and replicable. They establish systematic relationships between neural states and mental states, but establishing correlation doesn't constitute explanation. Consider an analogy from computer science. You can map every line of code in a program to its computational outcome. Given sufficient detail, you might predict outputs from inputs with perfect accuracy. Yet understanding the code's syntax and execution doesn't necessarily reveal what the program feels like from the inside, because programs don't feel like anything. The mapping relationship, however complete, doesn't address whether subjective experience exists at all. The situation differs with consciousness because we know from direct acquaintance that experience exists. You don't infer your own consciousness from behavioural evidence. You have immediate access to it. This creates an asymmetry. We're certain subjective experience is real. We're equally certain it correlates with brain activity. The question is whether the latter explains the former or merely accompanies it. Some neuroscientists argue this question mistakes the nature of scientific explanation. Physics doesn't explain why mass attracts mass. It describes gravitational behaviour mathematically. Chemistry doesn't explain why atoms bond. It characterises bonding patterns. Science describes regularities without necessarily illuminating ultimate whys. Perhaps asking why neural activity produces consciousness demands a kind of explanation science doesn't provide for any phenomenon. This response has merit but faces challenges. Unlike gravity or chemical bonds, consciousness presents an explanatory target that's simultaneously physical and experiential. We don't wonder what gravity feels like because gravity doesn't feel like anything. We do wonder what consciousness feels like because that's precisely what consciousness is, the feeling of being. The subjective dimension isn't incidental. It's the phenomenon requiring explanation. Mary's room thought experiment crystallizes this asymmetry. Mary, a brilliant neuroscientist, lives in a black and white environment. She learns everything physical science knows about color vision: wavelengths, photoreceptors, neural pathways, cortical processing. Her knowledge of color neuroscience is complete. Then she leaves the room and sees red for the first time. The question: does she learn something new? Intuitively, yes. Knowing every physical fact about red doesn't seem equivalent to experiencing red. The quale, the specific subjective character of redness, appears absent from physical description. If Mary learns something upon seeing red, that something wasn't contained in the complete physical account. This suggests consciousness involves facts beyond physical facts, or at least facts physical science can't capture through its standard descriptive vocabulary. Responses to this argument divide along familiar lines. Some accept the conclusion: consciousness really does involve non-physical facts, though not necessarily non-physical substances. Others reject the thought experiment's premise. Perhaps Mary doesn't learn new facts, but gains new abilities. The ability to recognize, imagine, and remember red. Or perhaps she learns old facts through new phenomenal concepts. What she couldn't know in the room wasn't physical information, but rather a particular way of accessing that information through direct experience. The phenomenal concept strategy suggests consciousness appears mysterious because we access it through two fundamentally different conceptual schemes. Neuroscience employs third-person concepts: objective, quantitative, publicly verifiable. Experience employs first-person phenomenal concepts: subjective, qualitative, privately accessible. These concepts pick out the same underlying states, neural processes, but from radically different epistemic positions. The gap between them is conceptual, not ontological. This view preserves physicalism while acknowledging why consciousness seems special. The mystery arises from our cognitive architecture, not from consciousness being non-physical. We're creatures who can think about our own mental states, both objectively and subjectively. These perspectives don't easily integrate because they're designed for different purposes. Objective concepts facilitate scientific understanding and interpersonal communication. Subjective concepts enable immediate self-knowledge and rapid behavioural guidance. Neither perspective reduces to the other, yet both characterise the same physical reality. Critics question whether conceptual dualism truly dissolves the problem. If phenomenal concepts access physical states in ways third-person concept can't, what explains this asymmetry? Why should certain physical states be accessible through phenomenal concepts at all? The conceptual gap itself demands explanation. We're back to asking why some physical processes generate subjective experience, while others, like digestion or protein synthesis, apparently don't. Integrated information theory attempts to answer by identifying consciousness with integrated information. A system is conscious to the degree it integrates information in a unified, irreducible way. This approach quantifies consciousness mathematically through phi, measuring how much information a system generates beyond its parts. High phi indicates rich conscious experience, zero phi indicates no consciousness. The theory predicts consciousness emerges in systems with specific architectural properties, extensive integration combined with differentiation. IIT offers testable predictions. It explains why the cerebellum, despite containing more neurons than the cerebral cortex, contributes minimally to consciousness. Its architecture favours parallel processing over integration. It accounts for consciousness fading during dreamless sleep when cortical integration decreases. The theory provides a principled way to assess consciousness in non-communicative patients or potentially in artificial systems. Yet IIT faces conceptual challenges. It identifies consciousness with a mathematical structure, integrated information, but doesn't obviously explain why that structure feels like anything. The theory describes conditions necessary for consciousness without illuminating why those conditions suffice. We're back to the implementation question. Even granting that consciousness requires integrated information, we can still ask why information integration produces subjective experience rather than occurring in darkness. Global workspace theory takes a different approach, emphasizing functional architecture over mathematical properties. Consciousness arises when information becomes globally available to multiple cognitive systems: perception, memory, planning, language. This broadcasting creates a unified experiential field from diverse inputs. What you're conscious of at any moment is what occupies the global workspace, accessible to various downstream processes. GWT explains attention, working memory, and reportability, the easy problems. It accounts for why conscious contents seem unified, despite arising from distributed neural processes. The theory aligns with neuroscience data, showing frontoparietal networks activate during conscious perception, regardless of content. Broadcasting mechanisms provide a functional story about consciousness's role in cognition. But does broadcasting constitute consciousness, or merely enable its reportability? The theory describes how information becomes accessible without addressing why accessibility entails experience. A sophisticated information routing system could broadcast data without generating phenomenology. Unless we assume information processing inherently feels like something, GWT explains consciousness's cognitive functions while leaving experience itself unexplained. This pattern repeats across neuroscience theories. Each identifies important aspects of consciousness: integration, broadcasting, recurrent processing, predictive coding. Each explains functional properties and neural correlates. None obviously explains subjective experience itself. The theories succeed as neuroscience, characterizing mechanisms, making predictions, guiding research. They struggle as explanations of phenomenology. Perhaps that struggle reveals more about our explanatory expectations than about consciousness. We demand a certain kind of explanation, one that makes subjective experience seem inevitable given physical facts. But maybe no explanation could satisfy that demand. The connection between physical processes and phenomenal experience might be a brute fact, not derivable from more fundamental principles. Just as fundamental physics contains irreducible constants, the speed of light, Planck's constant, consciousness might be irreducibly connected to certain physical processes without that connection being further explicable. This position, sometimes called Mysterionism, doesn't claim consciousness is magical or non-physical. It suggests human cognitive architecture limits our ability to understand certain relationships. We can grasp mechanisms. We can identify correlations. We cannot bridge the explanatory gap because our concepts, designed for navigating the world, aren't equipped to make subjective experience seem inevitable from objective processes. The limitation lies in us, not in nature. Mysterionism frustrates because it forecloses investigation. If consciousness is unknowable in principle, why conduct research? Yet perhaps the conclusion is more modest. We can understand consciousness's neural basis, functional roles, and behavioral manifestations. We cannot explain why these physical facts entail subjective experience using our current conceptual resources. That's not resignation, but recognition. Acknowledging limits while pursuing understanding where possible. The alternative is eliminativism. Perhaps consciousness as traditionally conceived doesn't exist. What we call subjective experience is actually a collection of cognitive functions, attention, memory, self-monitoring, that create an illusion of unified phenomenology. Introspection misleads us into thinking there's something special requiring explanation beyond these functions. Once we fully understand the mechanisms, the puzzle dissolves. There's no hard problem because there's no irreducible phenomenal consciousness. This view faces its own challenge, the intuition that consciousness is the most certain thing we know. Descartes' cogito still carries force. You might doubt external reality, but you can't coherently doubt that you're experiencing something. Eliminativism asks us to reject our most immediate datum as illusory. That's philosophically possible, but psychologically difficult. The burden of proof lies heavily on the eliminativist to show why we should distrust direct phenomenal acquaintance. These competing interpretations, physicalist emergence, conceptual limitation, principled Mysterionism, eliminativism, reflect fundamentally different attitudes toward consciousness. They disagree about what kind of thing consciousness is, what kind of explanation would satisfy, and whether satisfaction is achievable. Neuroscience progresses by bracketing these questions, studying mechanisms regardless of metaphysical conclusions. But the questions remain, and how we answer them shapes how we understand ourselves and our place in the natural world. Neuroscience maps neural pathways with extraordinary precision yet cannot explain why those pathways feel like anything at all. The disconnect isn't about missing data, it's about the kind of explanation neuroscience provides versus what consciousness seems to require. When researchers trace the visual cortex processing wavelengths, they describe mechanisms, neurons firing, information propagating through hierarchical networks. But that description never touches why processing those wavelengths produces the subjective experience of seeing red. The machinery runs perfectly in the account. Experience remains absent. This absence persists despite decades of progress. Modern imaging reveals which brain regions activate during specific conscious states. Lesion studies show how damage to particular areas eliminates certain experiences. Neuropharmacology demonstrates that chemical alterations change phenomenology predictably. Yet none of these achievements closes what philosophers call the explanatory gap, the conceptual distance between physical processes and subjective experience. Consider pain. Neuroscience explains nociception thoroughly. Tissue damage triggers specialized receptors. Signals travel through spinal pathways to the thalamus and cortex. The anterior cingulate cortex activates, along with the insular. Pain behavior follows predictably. The entire causal chain from stimulus to response is mapped. But mapping the chain doesn't explain why the process hurts. Why isn't the system simply unconscious information processing, generating appropriate withdrawal responses without any subjective dimension? The question applies universally. Visual processing explains how retinal signals transform through multiple cortical stages, extracting edges, colours, motion, objects. Yet it never explains why these transformations are accompanied by visual experience. Auditory neuroscience describes how sound waves become neural patterns representing pitch, timbre, location. But the description omits why hearing feels like something, rather than simply being information processing without phenomenology. Some argue this represents merely a practical limitation. Current theories are incomplete, but will eventually explain experience once we understand enough detail. Perhaps when we fully map the connectome and track every synapse, the explanation will emerge. But the problem seems conceptual rather than empirical. Adding more detail about physical processes doesn't obviously address why those processes generate experience. You could know everything about neural firing patterns and still face the same question. Why does this particular pattern feel like seeing red rather than hearing middle C or smelling coffee? The knowledge argument captures this gap formally. Imagine a neuroscientist who knows every physical fact about colour vision, every wavelength, every neural pathway, every processing stage. She's studied vision exhaustively, but has never actually seen colour herself. When she finally experiences red for the first time, does she learn something new? If yes, then physical knowledge doesn't exhaust facts about experience. There's something about what red feels like that isn't captured by physical description, no matter how complete. This conclusion troubles physicalists who maintain that consciousness is entirely physical. They respond with various strategies. Some deny that the neuroscientist learns new facts. She simply gains new abilities or new ways of accessing information she already possessed. Others argue the intuition that she learns something reflects confusion about concepts rather than genuine ontological gaps. The feeling that experience transcends physical explanation might stem from how we think about consciousness, not from consciousness itself being non-physical. Another response targets the explanatory gap directly. Perhaps explaining consciousness requires different conceptual resources than explaining other phenomena. When we explain biological function, we show how mechanisms produce adaptive behavior. When we explain consciousness, we need to show not just how mechanisms work, but why they feel like something. That's a categorically different explanatory demand. If consciousness inherently involves subjective perspective, then any purely objective description will seem incomplete by definition. Not because it misses facts, but because it misses the subjective mode of presentation. This suggests the gap might be epistemological rather than ontological. Physical processes could completely constitute consciousness while remaining conceptually irreducible to physical descriptions. Water is nothing but H2O molecules, yet the concepts water and H2O molecules differ in meaning and application. Similarly, conscious states might be nothing but brain states, while the concepts remain irreducible. The gap exists in our conceptual scheme, not in nature. But this resolution faces its own challenge. Unlike water and H2O, where empirical investigation revealed the identity, no amount of neuroscience seems positioned to reveal that brain states are conscious states in the same way. With water, we can explain its properties, fluidity, freezing point, transparency, by reference to molecular structure and bonding. With consciousness, knowing all the neural details doesn't obviously explain phenomenal properties. Why this pattern of neural activity feels like seeing red remains unexplained even after complete physical description. Some philosophers conclude the gap is principled and permanent. Consciousness might be a fundamental feature of certain physical systems, present whenever those systems exist, but not derivable from more basic physical facts. Just as physics contains irreducible constants like the speed of light, consciousness could be an irreducible connection between certain physical configurations and subjective experience. This view, sometimes called panpsychism or Russellian monism, doesn't deny physicalism, but expands what physical facts include. Others take a more deflationary approach. Perhaps consciousness, as traditionally conceived, is confused. What we call subjective experience might be a collection of cognitive functions: attention, memory, self-monitoring, metacognition, that create an illusion of unified phenomenology. Once neuroscience fully explains these functions, the puzzle dissolves. There's no hard problem because there's no irreducible consciousness requiring special explanation. Introspection misleads us into thinking something mysterious needs explaining beyond the functional capacities themselves. This eliminativism faces a significant burden. Consciousness seems like the most certain thing we know, more certain than physical objects or mathematical truths. Descartes' cogito still carries force. You might doubt everything else, but you cannot coherently doubt that you're experiencing something. Eliminativism asks us to reject this immediate datum as illusory. That's logically possible, but requires showing why we should distrust direct phenomenal acquaintance in favour of theoretical parsimony. Between these positions, Mysterionism accepting permanent inexplicability, eliminativism denying consciousness as traditionally conceived. Various physicalist strategies bridging the gap conceptually, no consensus exists. The disagreement isn't about empirical facts, but about what kind of explanation consciousness requires and whether that explanation is achievable. Neuroscience continues productively regardless. Researchers identify neural correlates, test theories about information integration, study how brain damage affects consciousness, develop treatments for disorders of consciousness. These investigations succeed as neuroscience, characterizing mechanisms, making predictions, guiding clinical practice. They don't depend on resolving the explanatory gap, yet the gap constrains how we interpret findings. When neuroscientists identify the neural correlative of visual awareness, specific patterns in the posterior cortex, does this correlation explain awareness or merely accompany it? The data supports both readings. You could say awareness is nothing but that neural pattern, making the correlation constitutive. Or you could say the pattern causes or enables awareness without being identical to it, leaving consciousness's intrinsic nature unexplained. These interpretations have different implications. If consciousness is identical to neural patterns, then manipulating those patterns manipulates consciousness directly. If neural patterns merely correlate with or enable consciousness, then the relationship might be more complex. The pattern could be necessary but insufficient, requiring additional conditions we haven't identified. Or consciousness could arise from the pattern through some mechanism we don't understand. Current neuroscience cannot distinguish these possibilities empirically. Both predict the same correlations. Both explain the same clinical phenomena. The difference lies in metaphysical interpretation, what kind of thing consciousness is and what kind of explanation would suffice. Neuroscience describes the territory successfully. Philosophy debates what that description means. This situation creates an unusual dynamic. Neuroscience advances steadily, accumulating detailed knowledge about brain function. Philosophy of mind remains deadlocked, with competing positions attracting sustained support despite decades of argument. The empirical progress doesn't resolve the philosophical debate because the debate concerns what would count as resolution. Some view this as healthy pluralism, different frameworks emphasizing different aspects of a complex phenomenon. Others see confusion needing clarification. Still others argue the entire framework is misconceived, requiring not better answers, but better questions. What's clear is that neuroscience explaining the brain completely doesn't automatically explain the mind, depending on what explanation requires. The distinction between brain and mind, then, isn't about substance dualism, separate physical and mental realms. It's about levels of description and what bridging those levels demands. Brain descriptions specify mechanisms, structures, functions. Mind descriptions capture subjective experience, phenomenal character, first-person perspective. Whether these descriptions refer to the same thing described differently or to genuinely distinct aspects of reality remains unresolved. Neuroscience succeeds magnificently at the former while leaving the latter open to competing interpretations, none of which current evidence definitively supports or refutes. Neuroscience can map the visual cortex with extraordinary precision, identifying which neurons respond to edges, colors, motion. It can predict behavioral responses from neural activity patterns. It can trace how information flows from sensory input through processing hierarchies to motor output, yet explaining why any of this activity feels like something, why there's a subjective experience accompanying these processes, remains conceptually unresolved. Not because neuroscience lacks data, but because the kind of explanation it provides doesn't address what requires explaining. This limitation isn't a gap in knowledge waiting to be filled by better instruments or more detailed models. It's a structural feature of how neuroscience operates. When researchers describe neural correlates of consciousness, specific patterns of activity that reliably accompany conscious states, they're identifying correlations. When they trace causal pathways showing how damage to certain regions eliminates certain experiences, they're establishing necessary conditions. These are remarkable achievements. They tell us where consciousness depends on brain function, how different experiences map to different neural patterns. Which mechanisms enable or prevent consciousness? What they don't tell us is why these particular physical processes generate subjective experience at all. Consider pain. Neuroscience describes the pathway from tissue damage through nociceptors to spinal cord to thalamus to somatosensory cortex. It identifies how different brain regions process pain intensity, location, emotional valence. It explains why certain injuries produce referred pain, why chronic pain persists after tissue heals, how analgesics interrupt the pathway. This mechanistic story is complete and successful. Pain clinics use it to develop treatments. Surgeons apply it to design anesthesia protocols. The explanation works, yet the explanation describes function without addressing phenomenology. It tells us how the system processes noxious stimuli. It doesn't explain why processing feels like anything. You could imagine, conceivably, a system performing identical functions without generating subjective experience. The neurons would fire in the same patterns. The behavior would remain unchanged, but there would be no felt quality, no what it's likeness. This possibility reveals that functional explanation leaves something out. Not additional functions we haven't discovered yet. Something categorically different from function. Philosophers call this the explanatory gap. The term doesn't suggest neuroscience has failed or that consciousness is mysterious. It identifies a conceptual mismatch. Physical descriptions specify structure, dynamics, causal relations. Mental descriptions capture subjective character, phenomenal quality, first-person perspective. Even complete physical descriptions don't logically entail mental descriptions. Knowing everything about neural firing patterns doesn't tell you what red looks like. Not because you lack information, but because what it looks like isn't the kind of fact physical descriptions convey. Some argue this gap reflects our cognitive limitations. Perhaps human brains evolved to understand medium-sized objects and social dynamics, not their own phenomenology. We might lack the conceptual resources to bridge the gap, just as dogs lack the conceptual resources for calculus. This Mysterian position accepts that consciousness is physical, while doubting we can ever explain it satisfactorily. The explanation exists in principle. Consciousness does arise from brain activity, but remains forever beyond our grasp. Others take the gap as evidence that consciousness isn't purely physical. If physical facts don't entail phenomenal facts, perhaps phenomenal facts are additional facts, not reducible to physical ones. This property dualism doesn't require immaterial souls or separate substances. It claims that even in a purely physical universe, conscious experience involves properties not captured by physical descriptions. Mental properties supervene on physical properties, change the brain and you change the mind, but aren't identical to them. The relationship is dependence without identity. Still, others deny the gap entirely. Eliminativists argue that folk psychology's conception of consciousness is confused, like the medieval concept of impetus. Neuroscience will eventually replace talk of subjective experience with more precise descriptions of information processing. What seems like an explanatory gap is really confusion about what needs explaining. When we understand consciousness correctly, the mystery dissolves. There's no phenomenal character requiring special explanation, only complex functional organization we mistakenly reify. These positions don't divide along empirical lines. All parties accept the same neuroscience findings. They disagree about what those findings mean and what explanation requires. A physicalist seeing identical neural correlates for identical experiences concludes identity. The neural pattern is the experience. A property dualist seeing the same data concludes correlation. The pattern accompanies, but doesn't constitute the experience. An eliminativist concludes the question is malformed. There is no experience separate from the pattern to explain. Current neuroscience cannot adjudicate between these interpretations. Consider binocular rivalry, where different images presented to each eye alternate in awareness despite constant sensory input. Researchers identify neural correlates. Activity in certain cortical regions tracks which image is consciously perceived while earlier visual processing remains unchanged. This supports theories distinguishing conscious from unconscious processing. It shows consciousness involves specific brain mechanisms rather than diffusing across the entire system. But does this correlation explain consciousness or merely accompany it? The physicalist says tracking the neural correlate tracks consciousness itself. They're one thing described two ways. The property dualist says the correlation shows dependence without identity. Disrupting the neural pattern disrupts consciousness, but the pattern's physical properties don't capture experiential properties. The eliminativist says there's no consciousness beyond the pattern to correlate. The pattern is all that exists, and talk of subjective experience is folk psychology awaiting elimination. Each interpretation fits the data. Each explains clinical phenomena. Each guides research productively. The physicalist develops better theories of neural information processing. The property dualist explores which physical configurations generate which phenomenal properties. The eliminativist refines functional descriptions, eliminating reference to subjective states. All three programs advance neuroscience while remaining conceptually incompatible. This situation persists because the question isn't empirical. It concerns what counts as explanation. For physicalists, showing that consciousness correlates perfectly with certain neural patterns, that manipulating those patterns manipulates consciousness reliably, that the patterns exhibit the same structure as reported experiences, this constitutes explanation. Once we understand the mechanism completely, nothing remains unexplained. The sense that something is missing reflects lingering dualist intuitions, not genuine explanatory gaps. For property dualists, mechanism describes necessary conditions without addressing sufficient conditions. Even complete mechanistic knowledge leaves the central question unanswered. Why do these mechanisms generate experience? The question isn't about additional mechanisms we haven't found. It's about the relationship between physical processes and phenomenal properties. Mechanisms can be necessary without being sufficient. Understanding how a television works doesn't explain why the screen displays images rather than remaining dark. That requires understanding the relationships between electronics and photons, not just the electronics alone. Eliminativists reject the question's presuppositions. They argue consciousness, as traditionally conceived, irreducible subjective experience, is a confused concept. Just as we no longer ask, what vital force animates living matter? Because vitalism was mistaken, we shouldn't ask, what physical process generates phenomenal consciousness? Because the phenomenal/physical distinction is mistaken. Neuroscience describes information processing. That's all there is. The feeling that something is left out reflects conceptual confusion, not ontological fact. None of these positions is obviously wrong. Physicalism is parsimonious and scientifically respectable. Property dualism respects intuitions about subjective experience. Eliminativism cuts through conceptual tangles by rejecting their premises. Each attracts sophisticated defenders. Each survives sustained criticism. The debate continues, not because participants ignore evidence, but because they weight different considerations differently. Parsimony versus phenomenology, scientific framework versus lived experience, theoretical elegance versus intuitive plausibility. Neuroscience proceeds regardless. Researchers don't need to resolve the explanatory gap to study neural correlates productively. Clinical practice doesn't depend on whether consciousness is identical to or merely correlated with brain activity. Treatments work either way. This practical success, alongside philosophical deadlock, creates an unusual situation. The science advances steadily, while its interpretation remains contested. We accumulate detailed knowledge about mechanisms, while disagreeing fundamentally about what that knowledge explains. Perhaps this reflects consciousness's unique status. Every other phenomenon science studies can be observed from multiple perspectives. Water's properties can be investigated chemically, thermodynamically, through various instruments and theoretical frameworks. Consciousness can only be observed first personally. You have direct access to your own experience. Everyone else's consciousness is inferred from behavior and neural activity. This asymmetry might explain why explanatory standards differ. Physical explanations satisfy third-person observation. Phenomenal understanding requires first-person access. These might be incommensurable. Or perhaps the gap will close as neuroscience matures. Historical precedent suggests many apparently unbridgeable explanatory gaps dissolved with better theory. Life seemed inexplicable in physical terms before molecular biology. Inheritance seemed mysterious before genetics. Maybe consciousness awaits its Darwin or Watson and Crick, a framework making the mind-brain relationship intelligible the way evolution made life's diversity intelligible. The gap would be practical, not principled. Patience and research would eventually bridge it. But the gap might be permanent, not because consciousness is special metaphysically, but because explanation has limits. Some facts might be irreducibly first-personal. Physical science describes the world from no particular perspective. Conscious experience is inherently perspectival. These might represent genuinely different aspects of reality, neither reducible to the other. Understanding their relationship might require new conceptual resources we currently lack and might never develop. The brain-mind distinction would persist not from scientific inadequacy, but from the nature of what's being related. What remains clear is that neuroscience explaining the brain completely doesn't automatically explain the mind, depending on what explanation demands. The distinction between describing mechanisms and explaining experience, between correlation and identity, between third-person observation and first-person phenomenology. These remain unresolved, not because neuroscience has failed, but because the resolution requires answering questions neuroscience doesn't address. The success of brain science leaves the status of mind science uncertain. Neuroscience can map neural circuits with extraordinary precision, identify activation patterns for thousands of cognitive processes, and predict behavior from brain states with increasing accuracy. But there remains something it cannot explain: why any of this feels like anything at all. The gap isn't empirical, it's conceptual, and it hasn't closed despite decades of progress. Understanding this limitation requires distinguishing what neuroscience actually accomplishes from what we intuitively expect it should accomplish. When researchers identify that activity in visual cortex V4 correlates with color perception, they've discovered something genuine. When they show that damage to Broca's area impairs speech production, They've established a causal relationship. When they trace how information flows from sensory input through processing networks to motor output, they've explained a functional system. These achievements are real and substantial. They answer questions about mechanism, about structure, about information processing, but they don't answer questions about subjective experience. Consider pain. Neuroscience can identify C fibers carrying nociceptive signals, trace pathways through the spinal cord to the thalamus and somatosensory cortex, demonstrate how anterior cingulate cortex processes the affective component, show how opioid receptors modulate the signal. This constitutes a complete mechanistic account of pain processing. Yet someone could understand this entire system perfectly, could predict when pain signals would fire, could manipulate the system to increase or decrease pain responses, and still reasonably ask, but why does this particular pattern of neural activity feel like something? Why does it hurt? The question isn't about missing information, it's about the kind of explanation being sought. Physical explanations describe processes, structures, functions. They answer questions about how systems work. Phenomenal understanding requires something different, access to what the experience is like from the inside. These might be fundamentally different explanatory projects. This is where philosophical interpretation begins and scientific consensus ends. Some argue the gap reflects incomplete theory. We simply haven't discovered the right framework yet, comparable to how molecular biology eventually explained life without invoking vital forces. The explanatory gap would be practical, not principled. Others maintain the gap is permanent because subjective experience constitutes a genuinely different aspect of reality, not separate from physical processes, but not reducible to them either. Still others reject the question's presuppositions entirely, arguing that subjective experience, as traditionally conceived, is confused, that neuroscience's mechanistic accounts are all there is to explain. The first position, physicalism, holds that mental states are identical to brain states. When you experience red, that experience just is a particular pattern of neural activity. Nothing additional exists. The feeling that something is left unexplained reflects our current theoretical limitations. Future neuroscience will close the gap by developing concepts, making the identity intelligible, the way chemistry made biological processes intelligible. The mind isn't separate from the brain. It's what certain brain processes are. Property dualism accepts mind-brain identity, but argues that mental properties, specifically phenomenal properties, can't be explained by or reduced to physical properties. Your experience of red is physically realized in neural activity, but the subjective character of that experience, what philosophers call its qualia, constitutes an irreducible feature. You could know everything about the neural correlates and still not know what red looks like. The explanatory gap is real and permanent because physical descriptions capture structure and function, while phenomenal descriptions capture intrinsic qualities. These are genuinely different aspects. Eliminativism takes a different approach. It argues that consciousness, as traditionally conceived, irreducible subjective experience, is a confused concept. Just as we no longer ask what vital force animates living matter because vitalism was mistaken, we shouldn't ask what physical process generates phenomenal consciousness because the phenomenal physical distinction is mistaken. Neuroscience describes information processing. That's all there is. The feeling that something is left out reflects conceptual confusion, not ontological fact. None of these positions is obviously wrong. Each survives sustained criticism. The debate continues not because participants ignore evidence, but because they weight different considerations differently. Parsimony versus phenomenology, scientific framework versus lived experience, theoretical elegance versus intuitive plausibility. Neuroscience proceeds regardless. Researchers don't need to resolve the explanatory gap to study neural correlates productively. They can identify which brain regions activate during conscious perception versus unconscious processing. They can determine that posterior cortical areas, particularly the hot zone, including sensory regions, correlate more closely with conscious content than frontal executive networks. They can show that certain patterns of neural activity, specific types of recurrent processing, particular oscillatory frequencies, global workspace activation, distinguish conscious from unconscious states. These findings advance understanding substantially. Clinical applications work. Treatments for disorders of consciousness don't depend on resolving whether experience is identical to or merely correlated with brain activity. This practical success, alongside philosophical deadlock, creates an unusual situation. The science advances while its interpretation remains contested. We accumulate detailed mechanistic knowledge while disagreeing fundamentally about what that knowledge explains. Perhaps this reflects consciousness's unique observational asymmetry. Every other phenomenon science studies can be investigated from multiple independent perspectives. Water's properties can be examined chemically, thermodynamically, through various instruments and theoretical frameworks. Consciousness can only be observed first personally. You have direct access to your own experience. Everyone else's consciousness must be inferred from behavior and neural activity. This asymmetry might explain why explanatory standards differ. Physical explanations satisfy third-person observation. Phenomenal understanding requires first-person access. These might be incommensurable, or the gap might eventually close as neuroscience matures. Historical precedent shows many apparently unbridgeable explanatory gaps dissolved with better theory. Life seemed inexplicable in physical terms before molecular biology. Inheritance seemed mysterious before genetics. The mind-brain relationship might await its Darwin or Watson and Crick, someone providing a framework making consciousness intelligible the way evolution made life's diversity intelligible. The gap would be practical, not principled. Patience and continued research would bridge it. But the gap might be permanent not because consciousness is metaphysically special, but because explanation has limits. Some facts might be irreducibly first-personal. Physical science describes reality from no particular perspective. Conscious experience is inherently perspectival. These might represent genuinely different aspects, neither reducible to the other. Understanding their relationship might require conceptual resources we currently lack and might never develop. The distinction would persist not from scientific inadequacy, but from what's being related. The functional approach offers another angle. Instead of asking what consciousness is ontologically, ask what it does. What causal role does conscious experience play? What would be different in a system lacking it? Some argue this shifts focus productively from metaphysics to mechanism. If consciousness serves specific computational or functional purposes, identifying those purposes constitutes explanation. The subjective character might be epiphenomenal, present but causally inert, or it might be how certain functional states present themselves first personally. Either way, functional analysis captures what matters scientifically. Critics respond that this sidesteps rather than solves the problem. Knowing consciousness's function doesn't explain why functional states feel like anything. A system could presumably perform the same functions without subjective experience. This is the philosophical zombie thought experiment. If zombies are conceivable, then functional explanation leaves something out. If they're not conceivable, that itself requires explanation. What remains clear is that neuroscience explaining brain function completely doesn't automatically explain mind, depending on what explanation demands. The distinction between describing mechanisms and explaining experience, between correlation and identity, between third-person observation and first-person phenomenology, these remain unresolved, not because neuroscience has failed, but because resolution requires answering questions neuroscience doesn't address. The success of brain science leaves mind science's status uncertain. Three interpretations persist. The gap is temporary, awaiting better theory. The gap is permanent, reflecting genuinely different aspects of reality. Or the gap is illusory, based on confused concepts. Each interpretation has sophisticated defenders. Each fits available evidence. None has achieved consensus. The brain-mind distinction endures not from ignorance, but from the complexity of relating mechanistic understanding to lived experience. Neuroscience maps neural circuits with stunning precision, identifies neurotransmitter systems, traces information flow through cortical hierarchies, and predicts behavioral outcomes from brain activity patterns. Yet when explaining why any of this feels like something, why neural firing produces subjective experience rather than simply occurring in darkness, the explanatory framework changes character entirely. The distinction isn't between what's known and unknown, it's between what current methods can address and what they systematically leave untouched. Consider memory consolidation. Neuroscience describes how hippocampal neurons encode spatial information, how sleep replay strengthens synaptic connections, how reconsolidation modifies stored representations. These mechanisms explain memory's function, its failures, its neural signatures, but they don't explain, and don't attempt to explain, what remembering feels like from inside. The warmth of recalling childhood summers, the sharp clarity of traumatic recall, the vague familiarity of half-forgotten names. These phenomenal qualities accompany the mechanisms, but aren't captured by mechanistic description. This asymmetry appears systematic rather than incidental. Every neural process neuroscience explains successfully involves observable behavior, measurable activity, functional relationships. What remains unexplained involves first-person character, the subjective texture accompanying but not reducible to those processes. The gap isn't ignorance awaiting further research. It's a category mismatch between explanatory frameworks. The Neural Correlates of Consciousness research program exemplifies this pattern. Investigators identify brain activity patterns associated with specific conscious experiences. Visual awareness correlates with posterior cortical activation. Bistable perception switches correspond to prefrontal dynamics. Anesthesia-induced unconsciousness shows characteristic changes in thalamocortical connectivity. These correlations accumulate steadily, becoming increasingly precise. But correlation differs fundamentally from explanation. Knowing that posterior cortical activity accompanies visual awareness doesn't explain why that activity produces visual experience rather than occurring without subjective accompaniment. A complete correlation catalogue, every conscious state mapped to its neural signature, would still leave this question unanswered. The correlation is real. The explanatory work remains undone. Some argue this reflects premature pessimism. Perhaps deeper mechanistic understanding will eventually bridge the gap. Perhaps integrated information theory, global workspace models, or predictive processing frameworks will provide genuine explanation rather than sophisticated correlation. Perhaps current puzzlement mirrors historical confusion about life before molecular biology or inheritance before genetics. This optimism faces a specific challenge. Previous explanatory gaps closed when investigators found mechanisms connecting observable phenomena. Genetics explained inheritance by identifying molecular replication systems. Molecular biology explained life by describing metabolic pathways and cellular machinery. Both involved relating observable inputs to observable outputs through causal chains. The consciousness case differs structurally. Subjective experience isn't observable from outside. Its relationship to neural activity isn't input-output correlation, but identity claim or emergence relation. Explaining why specific neural patterns produce specific experiences requires more than identifying mechanisms. It requires explaining why mechanisms produce experience at all. The knowledge argument illustrates this challenge. Mary, a neuroscientist, learns every physical fact about color vision while living in a monochrome environment. She knows photoreceptor types, wavelength processing, cortical organization. Then she sees red for the first time. Does she learn something new? Intuition suggests yes. Knowing all physical facts about red doesn't convey what seeing red feels like. This implies phenomenal facts differ from physical facts. Physical knowledge leaves something out, the subjective character of experience itself. Responses divide sharply. Some accept this conclusion, embracing property dualism or non-reductive physicalism. Experience represents a genuinely distinct aspect of reality, not deducible from physical description. Others reject the thought experiment's premise. Mary learns nothing new. She simply experiences familiar information differently. The appearance of new knowledge reflects conceptual confusion, not ontological gap. Neither resolution commands consensus. Each faces objections. Each requires accepting counterintuitive implications. The debate persists not from inadequate argument but from fundamentally different intuitions about what explanation requires. Split-brain research reveals another dimension of this complexity. Patients with severed corpus callosums show divided processing. Present a word to their left visual field, they can't verbally report it. The right hemisphere lacks speech production. Yet they can point with their left hand to the words referent. Information reaches one hemisphere, but not the other. This raises disturbing questions about conscious unity. If hemispheres process independently, are there two consciousnesses, or one consciousness with partial access? The verbal report says, "I saw nothing," while the pointing behavior indicates recognition. Which response reveals the patient's experience? Neuroscience describes the information flow precisely. Severing the corpus callosum prevents interhemispheric communication. Each hemisphere processes its input independently. Behavior reflects this division. But whether this creates two streams of consciousness or modifies one remains conceptually unresolved. Brain structure doesn't settle the question, because consciousness's unity or division isn't directly observable. The levels of explanation framework attempts to dissolve rather than solve these problems. Mental states and brain states represent different descriptive levels, like traffic patterns versus individual vehicle movements. Both describe the same reality at different scales. Neither reduces to the other. Both remain valid. This framework handles functional relationships well. Describing arithmetic computation requires mental-level algorithms. Describing neural implementation requires mechanistic details. Each level serves distinct explanatory purposes. Reduction isn't necessary for understanding, but phenomenal consciousness doesn't fit this pattern cleanly. Experience isn't a higher-level description of neural activity. It's something neural activity supposedly produces, or realizes, or accompanies. The relation isn't between coarse-grained and fine-grained descriptions of the same thing. It's between mechanism and product, substrate and phenomenon, unless it isn't. Perhaps treating consciousness as something produced by or emerging from neural activity misconstrues the relationship. Perhaps consciousness and neural activity are genuinely identical, not just correlated, but the same thing described differently. Brain states are conscious states. There's no production, no emergence, no gap to bridge. This identity theory faces its own challenges. If pain is identical to C fiber firing, why does knowing about C fibers feel different from experiencing pain? Why can we conceive of one without the other? Why does the identity seem contingent rather than necessary? Standard identities don't show this pattern. Water is H2O necessarily. Understanding water's properties requires understanding molecular structure. But understanding neural firing patterns doesn't seem to convey experiential qualities. The identity, if genuine, remains opaque in ways other identities aren't. Deflationary approaches reject the entire framework. There is no hard problem, no explanatory gap, no special feature requiring novel explanation. Consciousness talk refers to complex information processing. Once we understand the processing, we've explained consciousness. Residual puzzlement reflects conceptual confusion or persistent dualist intuitions, not genuine mystery. This deflation faces resistance. Most people, including many neuroscientists, find the hard problem compelling. Experience seems genuinely distinct from function. Eliminating this distinction feels like changing the subject rather than solving the problem. Yet deflationary arguments can't be dismissed as mere denial. They identify genuine confusions in how consciousness gets discussed. They question whether intuitions about explanatory gaps reflect reality structure or our cognitive limitations. They note that many apparently unbridgeable gaps dissolved with better theory. The disagreement runs deep, not about empirical facts, but about what constitutes explanation. Physicalists accept mechanistic description as complete explanation. Dualists, in non-reductive physicalists, demand something more, an account of why mechanisms feel like anything. Eliminativists question whether feeling like something picks out a coherent explanandum. These positions coexist because none faces decisive refutation. Neuroscience progresses without resolving which interpretation is correct. Researchers map correlates, identify mechanisms, develop interventions. The philosophical question remains open. Perhaps this reflects consciousness's unique observational status. Every other phenomenon science investigates can be studied from multiple independent perspectives. Chemical reactions, genetic inheritance, electromagnetic fields, all yield to third-person investigation. Consciousness requires first-person access. You experience your own states directly. Others' states must be inferred. This asymmetry might explain persistent disagreement. Third-person methods satisfy physicalist standards. First-person phenomenology resists those methods. Whether this represents permanent limitation or temporary inadequacy remains contested. The brain-mind distinction endures not from neuroscience's failure, but from unresolved philosophical questions neuroscience doesn't address. Mechanism and experience, function and phenomenology, third-person description and first-person access. These relationships resist consensus despite accumulating empirical detail. What neuroscience explains, it explains completely. What it leaves untouched might await better theory, require different conceptual resources, or reflect confused questions. Each interpretation has sophisticated defenders. None has won. The distinction persists because the relationship between explaining brain and explaining mind remains fundamentally uncertain. Neuroscience maps neural circuits with extraordinary precision, identifies neurotransmitter systems, traces signal propagation across cortical layers, predicts behavioral responses from activation patterns. Yet when researchers explain consciousness, the subjective character of experience, the explanatory power vanishes, not because neuroscience fails at its task, but because the task might require something neuroscience doesn't provide. This isn't about missing data. We know which brain regions activate during visual perception. We track how information flows from retina through thalamus to cortex. We can even predict which neural patterns correspond to seeing red versus blue. But correspondence isn't explanation. Knowing that specific firing patterns accompany color experience doesn't reveal why those patterns feel like anything at all. The disconnect becomes stark when comparing neuroscience's successes with its explanatory limits. Consider spatial navigation. Neuroscientists discovered place cells in the hippocampus that fire when an animal occupies specific locations. Grid cells encode geometric space. Head direction cells track orientation. Together, these systems create internal maps. The mechanism explains behavior completely. An organism navigates because its neural architecture computes position and trajectory. No explanatory gap remains. Now consider pain. We know pain pathways. Nociceptors detect tissue damage. Signals travel through the spinal cord to the thalamus, then to somatosensory and anterior cingulate cortex. We can identify exactly which neurons fire when someone experiences pain. We can even modulate pain by targeting specific circuits. The mechanism is well understood. Yet understanding the mechanism doesn't explain why it hurts. Why does this particular pattern of neural activity generate that specific quality of suffering? This asymmetry defines the explanatory problem. Functional descriptions, what the brain does, work perfectly. Phenomenal descriptions, what experience is like, resist the same framework. Neuroscience explains function by identifying mechanisms. Mental experience seems to require something more. Multiple interpretations exist. Perhaps consciousness is identical to neural activity, and the apparent gap reflects conceptual confusion rather than genuine mystery. When we say pain is C-fiber activation, we're stating an identity, not a correlation. The difficulty understanding this identity might reflect our cognitive limitations, not reality structure. We struggle to see how physical processes could be experiences because our conceptual frameworks separate the physical from the experiential. Better concepts might dissolve the puzzle. This identity theory faces challenges. If pain equals C-fiber activation, why does knowing about C-fibers tell us nothing about what pain feels like? When neuroscientists describe neural firing patterns, they describe physical processes, electrical signals, chemical transmissions, cellular responses. These descriptions are complete at their level. They explain everything neuroscience aims to explain, but they seem to leave out the experiential quality entirely. Consider Mary's room. the thought experiment where a neuroscientist learns every physical fact about colour vision while living in a black and white environment. She knows which wavelengths trigger which receptors. She understands how signals propagate through the visual system. She can predict neural responses to any colour stimulus. Then she sees colour for the first time. Does she learn something new? If physical knowledge exhausts what there is to know, she shouldn't. Yet most people intuit that she gains genuine understanding only through experience. This intuition might be mistaken. Perhaps Mary's new knowledge is simply a different way of accessing the same facts, a first-person mode of representation rather than new information. Experiencing red and knowing the neuroscience of red both refer to the same underlying reality, just accessed differently. The apparent novelty reflects representational differences, not ontological ones. Still, the representational difference requires explanation. Why should physical processes be representable in two incommensurable ways, mechanistic description and experiential access? Other physical phenomena don't show this pattern. Water's properties follow from molecular structure without requiring two fundamentally different modes of understanding. The molecular description captures everything relevant. Consciousness seems different. Some researchers argue this difference is illusory. Once neuroscience fully explains how brains process information, distinguish stimuli, form memories, guide behavior, nothing about consciousness remains unexplained. What people call phenomenal experience is simply complex information processing described from the inside. The what it's like character reduces to representational content and functional role. No additional element exists requiring novel explanation. This deflationary approach rejects the hard problem as conceptually confused. Asking why neural processes feel like something presupposes that feeling is something separate from processing. But perhaps feeling just names certain types of information processing: self-referential, integrated, accessible to reportage. Once we understand the processing, we've explained consciousness. Residual puzzlement reflects stubborn dualist intuitions, not genuine explanatory gaps. Yet the deflationary move faces resistance. Most cognitive scientists and philosophers find subjective experience genuinely distinct from function. You can imagine a system functionally identical to a human brain, processing information identically, producing identical behaviors, while doubting it has experiences. This conceivability suggests experience and function are genuinely different, not just different descriptions of the same thing. The zombie argument formalizes this intuition. A philosophical zombie is physically and functionally identical to a conscious being, but lacks subjective experience. Such zombies seem conceivable. If conceivable, they're logically possible. If logically possible, consciousness can't be identical to physical processes. The existence of the conceivability-possibility gap indicates something about consciousness that purely physical descriptions miss. Critics respond that conceivability proves nothing about possibility. Many inconceivable things are impossible. Many conceivable things turn out to be impossible given physical laws. Perhaps zombies seem conceivable only because we don't fully understand consciousness. With complete understanding, the incoherence of zombies would become apparent. The conceivability intuition might reflect ignorance rather than genuine metaphysical insight. This debate persists because neither side faces decisive refutation. Physicalists can always claim that better theory will close explanatory gaps. Non-reductive physicalists can always identify aspects of experience that seem to resist physical explanation. Eliminativists can always diagnose the problem as conceptual confusion. Each position has sophisticated defenders. None has won. Clinical neuroscience reveals how practical applications proceed despite theoretical disagreement. Understanding neural correlates of consciousness enables diagnosis and treatment of disorders of consciousness. Functional imaging distinguishes minimally conscious states from vegetative states by detecting preserved neural responses. Interventions target specific circuits to restore awareness. These applications work without resolving philosophical debates about experience's nature. The asymmetry extends to methodology. Every other phenomenon science investigates yields to third-person observation. Chemical reactions, electromagnetic fields, genetic inheritance, all can be studied from multiple independent perspectives. Results replicate across observers. Consciousness requires first-person access. Only you can directly observe your experiences. Others must infer them from behavior and brain activity. This methodological asymmetry might explain persistent disagreement. Third-person methods satisfy physicalist standards. They describe mechanisms, identify correlations, predict outcomes. First-person phenomenology resists these methods. Whether this resistance reflects permanent limitation or temporary inadequacy remains contested. Some argue consciousness's observational uniqueness makes it fundamentally unexplainable through standard scientific methods. Others maintain that improved theory and technology will eventually close the gap. Still others claim no gap exists, just confusion about what constitutes adequate explanation. The debate's persistence suggests something important. Unlike most scientific disputes, this one doesn't resolve through better data. Neural imaging improves. Circuit mapping becomes more detailed. Computational models grow more sophisticated. Yet disagreement about consciousness's fundamental nature remains. Either the question transcends empirical investigation, or we're asking it wrong. Consider what satisfies explanation demands in other domains. We explain water's properties by describing molecular structure. We explain inheritance by identifying genetic mechanisms. We explain combustion through chemical reactions. In each case, mechanism suffices. Once we understand how something works, we've explained it. The why question reduces to how. Consciousness seems to resist this reduction. Even with complete mechanistic understanding of brain function, the why does it feel like something question remains, or appears to remain. Whether this appearance reflects genuine explanatory incompleteness or conceptual confusion divides researchers. The levels of explanation framework offers one resolution. Neural events and mental events occur simultaneously, linked by a supervenient relationship rather than causal connection. Causality operates within levels. Neural causes produce neural effects, mental causes produce mental effects, but not between them. Mental states supervene on neural states without being identical to them or caused by them. This framework preserves both scientific explanation and phenomenal reality. Neuroscience explains brain function completely at its level. Psychology explains mental processes at its level. Neither reduces to the other. Neither contradicts the other. They describe the same events from different explanatory perspectives. Yet supervenience itself requires explanation. Why should certain physical configurations give rise to mental properties? What makes some neural patterns consciousness-bearing, while others aren't? The supervenience relation remains as mysterious as the identity relation it replaces. Perhaps mystery is inevitable. Human cognition evolved to navigate medium-sized objects at human timescales. Understanding consciousness might require cognitive capacities we lack. We might be asking questions our brains can't answer, not because the questions are bad, but because we're insufficiently equipped. Or perhaps consciousness will eventually yield to theoretical advance, the way other seemingly intractable problems did. Vitalism seemed compelling until biochemistry explained life processes. The nature of heat resisted explanation until statistical mechanics. Consciousness might await similar conceptual revolution. The brain-mind distinction persists because the relationship between explaining mechanism and explaining experience remains fundamentally uncertain. Neuroscience succeeds completely at its task, describing how brains function. Whether that task exhausts what needs explaining depends on philosophical commitments neuroscience doesn't adjudicate. What it leaves untouched might require different conceptual resources, await better theory, or reflect confused questions. Each interpretation has defenders. None has won. The distinction endures not from scientific failure, but from unresolved philosophical questions about what constitutes explanation itself. The explanatory gap separating neural mechanism from felt experience remains open despite centuries of investigation and decades of sophisticated neuroscience. Whether this gap reflects temporary theoretical inadequacy, permanent cognitive limitation, or conceptual confusion without ontological significance, divides researchers along lines that empirical evidence hasn't resolved. Each position maintains internal coherence while facing persistent objections. Those accepting the gap as genuine and permanent argue that physical descriptions operate in fundamentally different terms than phenomenal descriptions. Structure, function, and causation, the vocabulary of neuroscience, capture everything about how systems work without addressing what they're like from inside. This isn't ignorance awaiting correction, but categorical mismatch. The what-it's-like character of experience might supervene on physical processes without being derivable from them, much as liquidity supervenes on molecular arrangements without being predictable from molecular properties alone before we've encountered liquids. Others maintain the gap reflects incomplete understanding rather than principled inexplicability. Historical precedent shows apparently unbridgeable explanatory gaps closing when investigators developed appropriate theoretical frameworks. Vitalism seemed compelling until biochemistry explained metabolism. The nature of inheritance appeared mysterious until genetics revealed replication mechanisms. Consciousness might await similar conceptual revolution, perhaps through integrated information theory, predictive processing models, or frameworks not yet conceived. The current gap would mark our position in understanding's trajectory, not its terminus. Eliminativists reject the question's presuppositions. They argue that consciousness, as traditionally conceived, irreducible subjective experience, misconstrues what requires explanation. Once neuroscience fully describes information processing, attention, memory integration, and self-monitoring, nothing about consciousness remains unexplained. What seems like explanatory gap is conceptual confusion. Folk psychology's categories don't carve nature at its joints. Scientific psychology will eventually replace talk of phenomenal experience with precise descriptions of cognitive architecture, just as chemistry replaced phlogiston with oxidation. Each interpretation fits available evidence. Each guides productive research programs. Each survives sustained criticism. The disagreement doesn't concern empirical facts. All parties accept the same neuroscience findings, but what those facts mean and what explanation requires. This philosophical deadlock coexists with continued scientific progress. Researchers map neural correlates, identify consciousness-enabling mechanisms, develop clinical interventions. Applications work regardless of the theoretical interpretation. Perhaps the question transcends current conceptual resources. Perhaps it will yield to better theory. Perhaps it's malformed, asking after something that doesn't exist as supposed. These alternatives remain live options because consciousness presents a uniquely first-personal phenomenon in a scientific framework designed for third-personal investigation. Every other phenomenon science explains successfully allows independent observation from multiple perspectives. Consciousness requires access from within. Whether this asymmetry creates permanent explanatory limits or temporary methodological challenges remains contested. What's certain is that neuroscience explaining brain function completely doesn't automatically explain mind, depending on what explanation demands. The relationship between mechanistic understanding and experiential understanding, between correlation and identity, between describing structure and accounting for subjectivity, these remain unresolved, not because neuroscience has failed, but because they involve questions neuroscience's methods don't address. The brain-mind distinction persists because three interpretations, the gap is temporary, permanent, or illusory, coexist without decisive evidence favouring any. Each has sophisticated defenders, each faces persistent objections, none commands consensus. The distinction endures because the relationship between explaining mechanism and explaining experience remains fundamentally uncertain.